Hello, everybody. So today we are going to be talking about how we diagram those different complements that we've been talking about over the past 2 days. So direct objects, indirect objects, predicate adjectives, and predicate nominatives. So we're going to go ahead and dive right in here. So just kind of as a reminder, okay, when we are diagramming sentences, we have what is called the main line. Okay, so our main line is this line right here that all of the main components of our sentence appear on. So you're going to have your subject always on the left-hand side of that main line, and then you'll have your verb right next to it. We have this vertical line that separates our subject from our verb. Okay, that always stays the same. Then we can diagram adjectives underneath the words that they modify. Typically, they're going to be modifying the subject because remember, adjectives have to modify a noun or a pronoun. You can diagram adverbs underneath the word that they modify, which is typically the verb. Okay, now when we are doing predicate nouns and predicate adjectives, what we do is we write them right next to the verb, still on that main line, and we just separate them with a slanted line. Now notice about this slanted line, you guys, that it doesn't actually cross through the main line, it just kind of sits on top of it. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look at this example sentence. Now the first thing that we want to do whenever we are going to diagram a sentence is we want to first label our sentence. Okay, cross out those prep phrases, label the sentence. It's the exact same steps as when we're trying to identify the components in a sentence, because literally, you guys, diagramming is just identifying the different components in a sentence, but instead of just labeling it, you're also now putting it on a diagram. So I always think the best way to practice diagramming is just to make sure you label your sentence first, so that way you can kind of figure out how everything's working in the sentence before you plug it into the diagram. Okay, so let's look at our example sentence here together. So the first thing that we have to do is cross out our prep phrases. Well, good news, you guys, we haven't even learned how to diagram prepositional phrases. We're not going to do that until second semester. So none of the sentences that you guys are going to encounter on this slideshow or on your homework are going to have prep phrases. So you guys can just check that one off automatically, okay? None of these sentences are going to have prep phrases. Whoop, whoop. We like that. So the next thing that we have to do is identify our subject and our verb. Now, since we know we're looking for predicate nouns and predicate adjectives, we have to have a linking verb. Okay, so we look in our sentence to find our linking verb. Well, since we have our linking verbs memorized, we know that was is our linking verb. Okay, so go ahead and label it LV. Then we have to find our subject. Now remember, a subject typically comes before our verb. Okay, so wind is our subject. Okay, so we've got our subject, we've got our verb. Okay, now we think, what is the next step when we're looking for predicate nominatives or predicate adjectives? And we know we're looking for one of those, you guys, because of the linking verb. Okay, anytime you have a linking verb, remember, you're always going to be looking for a PN or a PA. So what we do when we have a linking verb, remember, is we replace it with that equal sign. Okay, so wind equals, what does it equal? Well, it equals our enemy. Now we just have to ask ourselves, is enemy a noun or is it an adjective? Well, enemy in this case is a noun, so we would want to label enemy PN. Okay, now we have a couple of other words here, the and our, that we have to figure out kind of what they're doing. So the, remember, is an article. Articles are always adjectives, so it is modifying wind. So just draw a little arrow there. And then our is telling us what kind of enemy it is. So it's answering one of those adjective questions, modifying the predicate nominative enemy. Okay, perfect. Now all that's left to do is for us to plug this into our diagram here. Okay, so we always start with the subject on the very far left-hand side on that main line. So we would put the subject wind there, and then we put our verb, which is was. We separate it from the predicate by this slanted line. So enemy will go on the far right-hand side of this diagram. And then remember, we just put those words that are modifiers underneath the word they're modifying. So whatever you're drawing an arrow to, that's what word it should go under. So the should go under wind, our should go under enemy, which, woohoo, we did it right. Okay, so that's how you do predicate nouns and predicate adjectives. But let me see if I can just erase this. Perfect. Oop. Okay, moving on. We also have direct and indirect objects. Now, direct and indirect objects function differently. Okay, we can't just diagram them the same as predicate nominatives and predicate adjectives, okay, because they don't really function the same. So when we have a direct object, it's going to go in the same place as a PN or a PA would. The only difference is this little line separating the direct object from the verb. Okay, this little line has to be up and down, not slanted. So whenever you have an action verb, you should have a straight up and down vertical line. Whenever you have a linking verb, that's when you need the slanted line. Okay, so everything else just still goes in the same spot. And we'll talk about indirect objects in a little bit because they're kind of very different. Okay, but for now, let's just take a look at this example sentence. The tornado destroyed homes. Okay, we know we don't have any prep phrases, so the next thing we have to do is identify our subjects and our verbs. Okay, so it's easy to identify the verb, destroyed, right? And that is an action verb. So we're going to label that AV for action verb. Okay, what's doing the destroying? Well, that would be the tornado. So tornado is our subject. Okay, so we have our subject, we have our action verb. The next step, you guys, is to ask our direct object question. Okay, so we ask our question using the subject and the verb. The tornado destroyed what? Homes, right? The tornado destroyed homes. So homes is our direct object. Oh my gosh, my handwriting is terrible on here. Okay, and then we just have this teeny tiny little the, and we have to figure out what it's modifying. Well, the is telling us which tornado it is, so it is modifying tornado. Then all we have to do is go and plug it into our diagram. Now, you guys are not going to get pre-made diagrams on your test. You are going to have to make the diagrams, and we're going to practice with that later. But for now, you're lucky, and we can just plug it in. So we always start with our subject. So we'll put our subject on the far left-hand side of that main line, and our subject is tornado. Next comes the verb. So we put destroyed. After the verb, separated by this vertical line, is homes, our direct object, and then we just have to put the underneath the word it's modifying, which is tornado. Okay, hopefully you're feeling pretty good about this. You guys, labeling your sentence is of the utmost importance. Okay, I have been drilling this into you. We do it for every single problem. You did it on your worksheet yesterday. It is going to help you when you go to diagram. Okay, because sometimes you're going to have compounds, which I think is coming up here in a little bit. And so you need to be able to see before you draw your diagram if you need to draw two subject lines, two direct object lines, etc. Okay, so labeling ahead of time is going to be super helpful. Okay, now we're talking compounds, like I just mentioned. Okay, so when we have a compound, you can have a compound complement. That's totally fine. All you do is you just split the main line wherever your compound is at. We did the same thing when we were studying just the basic subject and verb diagramming. If we had two or more subjects, we just split that main line on that subject side. If we had two or more verbs, we just split it on that verb side. Okay, so you just follow the same rule. Now, let's say you had a compound verb and a compound direct object, then your diagram, it's going to look a little weird, but it would look like this. So you would actually draw the lines like this, and you have the dotted line here, okay, and then you'd have your verb here, your conjunction and here, and your conjunction and here. Okay, so just so you guys kind of know, if you have that arise, you would just have them come together kind of at like an X is kind of how it would. But do not, you guys, do not forget this vertical line, okay? Even when you have compounds, you have to always remember that vertical line because that's what is indicating that you have a complement, okay? It separates your complement from your verb, okay? So it's very, very important that you remember that. Okay, so let's just take a look at this sample sentence. Again, we just want to label the sentence, right? So we look for our subject, we look for our verb. Okay, well, it's nice because our subject and our verb are exactly the same as the last example. So we have our subject tornado, and then we have our verb destroyed, and it is an action verb. Okay, then we know when we have an action verb, we have to ask our direct object question. So the tornado destroyed what? Well, we know it destroyed homes because that was in the last one. But in this example, it also destroyed businesses. So here we have two direct objects. Okay, the conjunction just joins the two together, so we don't have to do anything with labeling that. And then we know that the is modifying tornado. Okay, so now that we have our sentence labeled, we can plug it into our diagram. Again, we start with our subject tornado. It's followed by our verb destroyed. Okay, then we have our split here Now, what goes on top is always the first word that comes in the sentence. So homes needs to go on top. Businesses will go on bottom. Don't forget to put the and in between, and then the under tornado. I'm sure you guys are doing awesome and you're like, oh my gosh, this is so easy, because it is, right? Once you guys label your sentence, this just ends up being so stinking easy. It's kind of a joke. Okay, we're going to keep moving on. Now you can have a compound verb with each verb having their own direct object. So this is, again, why labeling is so important. And you always want to make sure you're labeling every subject and every verb in the sentence, okay, not just the first ones that you see. Now, in this example, we're going to have two verbs. You don't always have punctuation separating your verbs, right? If you ever have punctuation, you're looking for a completely separate subject and verb. Okay, but in this example, we only have one subject that's sharing two different verbs. So let's kind of take a look at this sample sentence and see if we can figure it out. Okay, again, I'm not getting very creative with my sentences here. So we already know that the subject's tornado, the verb is destroyed, and it is an action verb. Okay, but we have another verb here. Okay, so be careful, because the tornado destroyed, but it also did something else. It changed. Okay, and changed is also an action verb. So we want to make sure that we label that action verb changed as well. So always make sure you're looking at the rest of the sentence and labeling appropriately and accordingly. Okay, then we have to ask our direct object question for each of these verbs individually. So let's just start with the first one. The tornado destroyed what? Well, it destroyed homes. And then the tornado changed what? It changed the landscape, right? So we label, and then we just have to draw our arrows for the thes, which we have one there, and then we also have one over here for landscape. Okay, once we've labeled, then we can plug it in. Again, pretty easy, right? So what comes first is always the subject. Then we have to make sure whatever verb comes first in the sentence, we split the main line and we put that verb on top. So we're going to put destroyed up here, and it's followed by its direct object home. Okay, and please notice how I made this diagram. And you guys have this in your notes now, so if you come across a sentence like this, you can reference your notes. Okay, then we have our second verb, which is going to go on the bottom, which is changed, and then the direct object landscape goes along with that. Don't forget your conjunction and your thes under tornado and landscape. Yay, doing so good. Okay, we're almost done, I think. Don't quote me on that. All right, now we have to talk indirect objects. Okay, indirect objects are diagrammed completely differently from the other complements. Okay, the way that we diagram indirect objects is we put them on a line, a horizontal line, connected to the verb with a slanted line. So it just kind of looks like this. Okay, and the indirect object, you guys, is always going to go underneath the verb. Okay, it goes underneath the verb. Because remember, our indirect objects are always going to come between our verb and our direct object. So when we go to read the diagram, we're going to read it across and down first. So it'll go subject, verb, indirect object, direct object is how you would read that. Okay, so that's kind of why we diagram it there. And it's also giving us more information about or completing the verb, okay, which is why it goes underneath the verb. So again, you do the same thing, you guys. You just want to figure out your subject, figure out your verb, and then ask your direct and indirect object questions. So let's take a look at this example sentence. We first need to figure out the subject and verb. Well, I think the verb is easier to do, so let's look for the verb first. The storm gave townspeople a terrible night. Okay, gave is our verb. Gave is an action verb, right? You could see somebody doing the giving. So gave is our verb, and we ask ourselves, what's giving? Well, the storm is the one giving, okay? So storm is our subject. So we have our subject, we have our action verb. Since we have an action verb, we have to ask our direct object question. The storm gave what? Okay, now be careful here. The storm gave what? And the answer to that question would be night. Doesn't make a whole lot of sense, right? But if we ask that question, it's the only word that works. So the storm gave what? It gave a terrible night. Now, and terrible are actually modifiers of night. Okay, so they're just adjectives modifying night. Then we ask our indirect object question. Now remember, our indirect object always has to come between the verb and the direct object. So to ask our indirect object question, we ask to whom or for whom. So the storm gave a terrible night to whom? And obviously the only answer and word left is townspeople. So townspeople is our indirect object. This first the is modifying storm. So make sure you draw that arrow too. Okay, now we are ready to fill in our diagram. So again, we start with our subject, which is storm. It's followed by our verb, which is gave. And then we put the direct object behind the verb. Don't forget to separate it with that vertical line. So our direct object is night. Okay, what did I do next? Okay, the indirect object, remember, goes underneath the verb on that slanted horizontal line. I don't know what you would call that. I don't know what kind of angle that is. Somebody in math, shout out the angle. I don't know. I'm bad at math. I know it's bigger than 90 degrees. That's all I know. Okay, so townspeople goes there, and then we have to just plug in the rest of our adjectives. So we want to put the under storm and terrible underneath night. Hopefully you guys are feeling pretty good about this. Okay, I just want to give you just this diagram really briefly. Okay, so this is just a really good kind of like quick go-to basic template that you guys can use for action and linking verbs. So if you have an action verb, then this would be the basic template you use. If you have any of these components, you can put them in this order. So you always start with your subject, then you have your verb. Okay, then if we have an action verb here, you're going to have your direct object after your verb, separated with this vertical line. Your indirect object will go below the verb. You have any adjectives under the subject, or you could have adjectives describing the direct object like we saw in our last example, and then any extra adverbs could go underneath the verb as well. Okay, now if you have a sentence, let's say, that has an action verb, but maybe it has two direct objects or two indirect objects, that's totally fine. You just split that line wherever you need to split it. So like if you have two indirect objects, you would just split it like this, make it two, or did I say indirect? If you have two direct objects, just split it like that, and then you would have a direct object here and a direct object here. And same if you have an indirect object, right? If you have two indirect objects, you would again just split this line like this. Okay, you'd have an IO here, and then you would have an IO down here, and of course you would have the dotted line with your conjunction there. Okay, anywhere you have compounds, you guys, just feel free to split the diagrams accordingly. If you have a linking verb, okay, this one I have a compound subject. Of course, you won't always have a compound subject. I just wanted you to have a visual as to what that would look like if it was split. I'm going to move myself here. Then you would have the verb, right? Okay, the verb would follow. And then we have the predicate nominative. So if you guys want to write this in, this is either going to be the PN or the PA. Okay, then you'll have your predicate nominative or your predicate adjective coming after the verb. But you guys, do not forget that the line has to be different. Okay, these lines separating your verb from your complement are what are going to show me that you know if it's a direct object or a PN or PA. Okay, so it is of vital importance that you get these lines correct. So just know if you have an action verb, you better have a straight up and down line. If you have a linking verb, you better have a slanted line. Just remember that. Remember that. Okay, so that is all that I have for you guys as far as notes go. The rest of the slide is just practice for you guys to do. So Mrs. K can answer any questions for period 2 that you guys might have, and you guys are going to go through these practice problems together. Okay, so please go ahead and just listen to her instructions, fill out the practice, and I will make sure to post the answer key for these practice problems at the end of the day so that you guys can look at your work. And then for homework tonight, you do have a diagramming worksheet that you picked up from the back cube. Have an awesome day, you guys, and I will see you tomorrow.